Hello and welcome to Indus News, live from Islamabad. I am Muneeb Hamid with the news of this hour. Let's begin with the top stories first. Pakistan has condemned the high levels of violence in Afghanistan. Foreign Office spokesperson Zahid Hafiz Chaudhry said this during a weekly press briefing in Islamabad. Chaudhry said Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi spoke to his Afghan counterpart Hanif Atmar over a phone conversation. Qureshi emphasized that progress in the intra-Afghan negotiations would also help reduce violence, leading to a ceasefire. China says Taiwan is an inseparable part of the country and warned that its independence will mean war. At a news briefing, Chinese Defense Ministry spokesperson Wu Keqian said armed forces will respond to any provocation. The United States has paused the $8 billion weapons sale to Saudi Arabia and the UAE authorized by former President Donald Trump. Talking to reporters, Secretary of State Antony Blinken said review of the deal aims to ensure it advances U.S. strategic objectives. Speaking on Iran, he said the U.S. will rejoin the 2015 nuclear deal only if Iran resumes complete compliance with the pact. Brazil has registered more than 1,200 new COVID-19 deaths and 63,000 cases overnight. The nationwide tally of cases is approaching 9 million. Meanwhile, a Britain and European Union's row over AstraZeneca vaccine continues as Brussels rejected that the UK has first claim on doses produced at local plants. In Pakistan, more than 1,900 people tested positive and 64 lost their lives in the past 24 hours. This has pushed the nation's death toll to over 11,500. Globally, the virus has claimed 2 million lives and infected more than 100 million people so far. And South Africa have scored 86 runs for the loss of 1 wicket in the second innings of their first test against Pakistan. Earlier today, the hosts were bowled out for 378 runs on the third day of the match. And these were the top stories. News in detail after a short break. Stay with us. Welcome back. Now let's have the news in detail. We'll start from Pakistan, which has condemned the high levels of violence in Afghanistan. Foreign Office spokesperson Zahid Hafiz Chaudhry said this during a weekly press briefing in Islamabad. Chaudhry said Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi spoke to his Afghan counterpart Hanif Atmar over a phone conversation. Qureshi emphasized that progress in the intra-Afghan negotiations would also help reduce violence, leading to ceasefire. Chaudhry said Qureshi also urged the United Nations to address the root cause of conflicts, including foreign occupation, injustice and brutality. Chaudhry said the foreign minister also called for establishing a COVID-19 vaccine fund. Now, China says Taiwan is an inseparable part of the country and warned that its independence will mean war. At a news briefing, Chinese Defense Ministry spokesperson Wu Keqian said armed forces will respond to any provocation. The spokesperson said the military activities in Taiwan Strait are necessary to address the security situation. He added they are a solemn response to external interference and provocations by independence forces. Wu said a handful of people in Taiwan are seeking the island's independence, and those who play with fire will burn themselves. This follows a U.S. push for Taiwan's sovereignty in violation of its agreement with Beijing to abide by the One China policy. Now, the U.S. has paused the $8 billion weapons sale to Saudi Arabia and the UAE authorized by former President Donald Trump. Talking to reporters, Secretary of State Antony Blinken said a review of the deal aims to ensure it advances U.S. strategic objectives. Blinken termed the move routine procedure for any new administration. Talking about Yemen, Blinken said the ongoing conflict and violations by warring sides have caused a severe humanitarian crisis, which is why he said the previous administration's call for sanctions on Houthis is being re-evaluated. The U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken speaking.
And so it's vitally important, even in the midst of this crisis, that we do everything we can to get humanitarian assistance to the people of Yemen who are in desperate need. And what we want to make sure is that any steps we are taking do not get in the way of providing that assistance.
Also speaking on Iran, he said Washington will rejoin the 2015 nuclear deal only if Tehran resumes complete compliance with the pact. Now moving on, the Iraqi army says it has killed 7 ISIS militants, including 3 group leaders, in a counter-terrorism operation in the north. In a statement, the military said the terrorists were killed in a gunfight in Kirkuk city's Al-Chai Valley. It said several terrorists detonated themselves in their shelters after the raid. Earlier, the Iraqi forces in Kirkuk also foiled ISIS attacks and arrested 2 operatives on Wednesday. In 2017, Iraq declared victory over the terrorist group, who overtook a third of the country in 2014. But in recent months, suspected militants have stepped up attacks, particularly between Kirkuk and Diyala province. Meanwhile, at least 16 people have been killed and several others wounded in 3 separate bomb blasts in Somalia. The military says the bomb targeted a vehicle carrying military personnel near Balad Middle Shabelle. In a statement, the military said 12 soldiers and 2 civilians were killed in the attack. It said after the bombing, a gunfight broke out between the armed backed by the African Union peacekeeping mission and the militants. The Al-Qaeda-linked Al-Shahbab group has claimed responsibility for the attack. Meanwhile, a blast in a restaurant killed a soldier and wounded at least 5 civilians in Din Sur in the northwestern Bay region. Over in the capital, Mogadishu, a bomb blast killed a civilian and wounded 2 others. Moving on now, Brazil has registered more than 1,200 new COVID-19 deaths and 63,000 cases overnight. The nationwide tally of cases is approaching 9 million. Meanwhile, a Britain and European Union row over AstraZeneca vaccine continues as Brussels rejected that the UK has first claim on doses produced at local plants. Globally, the virus has claimed 2 million lives and infected more than 100 million people. More on coronavirus in this report. As the world's fight against the coronavirus pandemic continues, the Global COVID Performance Index has ranked New Zealand, Vietnam and Taiwan as top 3 for successfully handling the outbreak. Some of the world's most developed countries, including Britain and the United States, are placed near the bottom of the list, which evaluated 98 countries' response to the crisis. The Americas only now account for 1 million COVID-19 deaths, making half of the global fatalities. Meanwhile, the White House official says it will take months before a vaccine is available to the general public.
We change the vaccine composition twice a year for the northern and southern hemisphere, and we're able to issue vaccines very, very quickly to combat the predominant flu strains every year. So there's no reason, even down the line, if this virus evolves to a point where our vaccines begin to lose effectiveness, we can adapt those vaccines, and I believe we can adapt those vaccines quickly.
AstraZeneca is set to produce more than 90 million coronavirus vaccine shots in Japan. Over in Europe, the EU has demanded Oxford's drug maker to spell out how it will supply the bloc with reserved vaccines amid a deadlock in crisis talks. Meanwhile, a study found that Pfizer's vaccine appeared to lose only a small bit of effectiveness against the new variant first found in South Africa. The World Health Organization says vaccines can be adopted to new variants if they impact the effectiveness of vaccines.
We're facing 2 constraining factors. The first is getting enough supply quickly enough. And the second is the ability to administer the vaccines quickly once they're produced and sent out to the sites. We are taking action to increase supply and increase capacity. But even so, it will be months before everyone who wants a vaccine will be able to get one.
Australia has extended its suspension of quarantine-free travel with New Zealand as the latter detected the 2 cases of the newly found variant. In Lebanon, at least 20 people were injured in clashes after security forces opened fire on protesters in the Tripoli district north of the capital, Beirut. Lebanese took to the streets for a third day to denounce the deteriorating living conditions amid a strict lockdown to prevent the spread of the virus. Meanwhile, in Pakistan, 64 people have lost their lives to COVID-19 over the past 24 hours. This pushes the country's death toll to 11,514. The Health Ministry says 1,910 new infections were detected overnight. Currently, there are more than 33,000 active COVID-19 cases in the country. The Health Ministry says out of over 539,000 infected countrywide, more than 494,000 have recovered. The ministry added over 243,000 cases have been detected in the Sindh province. Punjab has reported nearly 156,000 cases, while in the capital, Islamabad, over 41,000 people have been infected so far. Now, Palestine has welcomed U.S. President Joe Biden's announcement to resume diplomatic ties. Ramallah says Palestine's president and prime minister welcomed the move, which emphasizes U.S. support for the two-state solution. A government spokesperson said Palestine is keen to resume talks in line with UN resolutions and international law. Ibrahim Milhem said any solution that does not take into account Palestinian rights mandated by international laws will fail. In another development, the Palestinian leadership has condemned the demolition of a mosque in occupied West Bank by the Israeli forces. Israeli forces razed the mosque and several structures in the West Bank. Meanwhile, the United States and Germany have vowed close cooperation in a wide range of issues. In their first phone call, German Foreign Minister Heiko Maas congratulated his U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken on his appointment. In a tweet, Germany Foreign Minister said both agreed to cooperate closely on issues including China's global role and Iran nuclear deal. Meanwhile, the new U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin also held a telephonic conversation with his German counterpart. In a statement, the Pentagon said the Defense Secretary praised Berlin for hosting U.S. troops. It said Austin also spoke about force posture in Afghanistan and Iraq and combating the malign influence of shared strategic rivals. Now, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson is visiting Scotland today to confront the growing support for another independence referendum. Ahead of his trip, Johnson recalled the privilege that Scotland is receiving as part of the UK, including access to coronavirus vaccine. However, Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon criticised Johnson's planned trip to Glasgow. Sturgeon questioned if the Prime Minister's reasons for visiting are essential and called for the trip a bad example. Johnson's ties with the Scottish First Minister have not been in the best shape as he dismissed multiple calls for another referendum. However, the chances of a second vote could improve if Sturgeon's party wins Scotland's devolved parliamentary elections in May. US President Joe Biden has signed more executive orders to combat climate change. The dictates map out the direction for Biden's climate change and environmental agendas. They include the creation of new climate change positions and an interagency task force within the new U.S. administration. The latest actions also pause new oil and gas leases on federal land and cutting fossil fuel subsidies. The president emphasized the need for the U.S. to lead the global response to climate change.
And just like we need a unified national response to COVID-19, we desperately need a unified national response to the climate crisis, because there is a climate crisis. We must lead the global response, because neither challenge can be met, as Secretary Kerry has pointed out many times, by the United States alone. We know what to do. We've just got to do it.
Now, the U.S. Homeland Security has warned for further potential attacks from domestic extremists like the Capitol Hill storming. In a statement, the DHS said a broad range of ideologically motivated actors could incite or commit violence. It said a heightened threat environment will persist for weeks after President Biden's inauguration. Meanwhile, the U.S. has secured an indictment against 3 members of the far-right Oath Keepers militia. They are accused of conspiring the U.S. Capitol rights in a bid to stop Congress from certifying Biden's election victory. The charge can carry a maximum prison sentence up to 20 years. More news coming up in this bulletin after a short break. Stay with us. Welcome back now. Moving on with the news stories. New Zealand will decarbonise its public house buses by 2035 and introduce a law this year to import clean cars to cut emissions and fuel costs. Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern said this in a news conference as the country pushes for a carbon neutral target by 2050. Ardern said the government will also mandate lower emitting biofuels across its transport sector and buy only zero emissions public transport buses from 2025. The government aims to prevent up to 3 million tonnes of emissions by 2040. It will consider an incentive scheme to help people switch to clean cars. Now, climate change has had a tremendous impact on the people of Burkina Faso. Drought has become the endemic, while violent floods have forced thousands of people to find refuge. Additionally, violence and the pandemic has made the country at the epicenter of the world's fastest growing displacement and protection crisis. Details in this report.
In Africa's turbulent Sahel region, Burkina Faso has been hit hard by climate change. 1 out of every 20 people is internally displaced. Across the Sahel, refugees, internally displaced people, and their hosts are subjected to brutal violence, including rape and executions.
I left home because of insecurity. Terrorists came into our village and started killing people. That's why we came here to Kongausi.
The decreased rainfall and depletion of soil due to agriculture overexploitation, deforestation are the main causes of the hard impact of climate change. As the agriculture sector collapses, more and more people are struggling to find refuge. For now, the situation shows no sign of improving.
Climate change has become a threat multiplier. In this context, unsurprisingly, we are seeing conflict over farmland, conflict over grazing land, and access to water, as well as its impact on conflict between communities and security issues.
The COVID-19 pandemic has added a new layer of hardship for the refugees and further complicated efforts to support them. The United Nations Refugee Agency has obtained land from regional authorities to help the IDPs. UNHCR is also rehabilitating the refugee families who had to flee earlier this year. With minimum resources, it has become difficult to aid the larger number of internally displaced people.
Imagine these people who have had to abandon everything, all their belongings, to flee insecurity and find themselves in a situation of total despair here. And then they have to bear the brunt of situation linked to global warming. It's a double dose of human suffering, difficult to bear.
UNHCR has warned again that attacks by armed groups in the Sahel region will lead to further displacement in a region already hosting nearly 2 million IDPs and hundreds of thousands of refugees.
Now, Apple has reported holiday quarter sales and profits that beat Wall Street expectations. The new 5G iPhones helped push handset revenue to a new record and sparked a 57% rise in China sales. Apple's revenue for the quarter ended December 26 rose 21% to more than $111 billion. Earnings per share rose to $1.68 from $1.25. Sales of iPhones were 65.60 billion compared with estimates of 59.80 billion. They beat Apple's previous quarterly all-time high of 61.58 billion for the first quarter of fiscal 2018. The company also posted strong sales of its Mac laptops and iPads in the quarter. It was driven by consumers working, learning and playing from home during the pandemic. While Samsung Electronics has posted a 26% rise in its operating profit in the fourth quarter of 2020 from a year earlier. The company says the increase was led by strong memory chip shipments and display panel sales. In a statement, Samsung said its operating profit in the quarter rose to over $8 billion. It said the company's revenue rose 3%. Meanwhile, the Seoul-based tech giant said it expects its overall profits to weaken in the first quarter of 2021. The forecast comes despite expected solid demands for its mobile products and data centers businesses. Meanwhile, European stocks have dived as global markets react to a sharp sell-off on Wall Street. The pan-European stock 600 and Frankfurt's DAX have plummeted close to 2%. London's FTSE and Italy's FTSE MIB have shed over 1%. In Paris, the CAC 40 has slipped nearly 1%. Earlier, the Asian stocks also tumbled, with all major regional bourses shedding more than 1.5%. And with that, we come to the end of this bulletin. For the latest updates, you can follow us on social media at Indus News.